Just as we did in Orchestration 102, the wind section, let's start at the top of the score and make our way down, family by family. As we learned in that course, woodwind families are based on one standard model, and that model provides the basis for tone, fingering, registers, and embouchure. Even a specialist on an auxiliary member of a given family will still tend to be an expert player of its standard model, and will have started on that model in their training. This may seem like an obvious point, but all too often, a developing composer may easily fall in love with auxiliary instruments out of a fascination with huge orchestrations and unusual textures, at the expense of truly mastering the scoring of the standard instruments upon which those auxiliaries are based. If your favorite instrument is the basset horn, then that's fine. But if you want to score effectively for it, then you must have a deep understanding of the standard clarinet. Ultimately, you might learn to get more satisfying results out of the most accessible instruments, which in turn increases the likelihood that your score will be performed. So let's begin our in-depth training with the flute. To review, the flute has a range of a little over 3 octaves, from B below middle C all the way up to the highest D on the piano. This represents 3 half-steps out on the extension or foot of the flute, an octave of fundamental tone spanning a D major scale, a further octave played with second partial overblowing, and a third octave overblowing higher partials from the 3rd to the 7th. That's the full range that you can expect from a professional concert flutist. To a player, these natural divisions are often called registers, but what they think and what a composer thinks is not always the same. An orchestrator tends to define registers according to their strength, tone, and compatibility between instruments and sections of the orchestra. For some instruments, like the clarinet and the bassoon, the overblowing and fingering registers correspond very well with the way orchestration teachers define them. But for the oboe and the flute, the same can't be said. While the players may divide their registers neatly into fundamentals, second partials, and then a third octave of higher partials, virtuoso orchestrators like Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov think of registers in terms of tone quality. Part of this reason goes back to the physics of waveforms. The very long fundamental nodes of the flute's lowest notes require a lot of breath, and don't project with the same force as the other wind instrument's fundamental tones. All the same, they have a calm elegance, or even a feeling of suspense and watchfulness. These qualities are very useful for a certain type of descriptive scoring, so long as the rest of the orchestra is supporting very softly. As the pitches rise, the fundamental nodes become shorter and more powerful, easier to play and much more audible in an orchestral arrangement. The higher fundamental pitches from A to C sharp, and the second partial pitches from D up to G above the staff, all have a certain expressive pliability about them, with very easy-to-control inflections and shades of tone. And yet this range also has a wonderful clarity and simple directness. These qualities are undoubtedly why Rimsky-Korsakov calls this register both sweet and transparent. As poetic as that may sound, the flute's middle register is still all too easily covered up by loud or thick orchestral scoring. Solos and featured lines in this range are much more effective with lighter scoring, though it need not be as sparse as when accompanying the flute's lowest register. As the flute ascends into its high register, it becomes ever brighter and more commanding. This is the register in which most of its memorable solos are written. Many developing composers are too cautious in generously scoring this high register, and then compound the error by scoring many passages too low. But if you want the flute to be heard clearly, you can't beat A above the staff, up to G a seventh higher. Even in very soft, calm passages, the flute sings out with little trouble. The flute's clear projection in this register means that the orchestra can be full and surging beneath it, and still cut through clearly over the texture with no unison doubling. The flute's altissimo register isn't as distinct a range as its lowest octave. For the orchestrator, it's more a matter of seeing how high phrases can be pushed, often while doubling soaring string melodies. How high is that? G-sharp and A are easy, B-flat and B a bit more intense, and then the top C takes a lot of focus. C-sharp and D can only be safely scored for working professionals, but doubling with strings can smooth things over. When the flute plays altissimo solos, the sound becomes ever more bird-like as the waveforms get squeezed and the overtones tighten up. Use this range sparingly, because the audience's ear will tire out right along with the player's embouchure. A very common stage of orchestration education is learning the overall ranges of each instrument. But the orchestrator should also know the registers extremely well. All too often, a developing composer will score an auxiliary woodwind where none is needed. For instance, assigning an alto flute to low notes that are perfectly within the range of the C flute, or a piccolo to high notes that would actually be clearer and more full-bodied on the standard model. Even at that, a thorough familiarity of the flute's registers is not enough. Let's examine its essential character and extraordinary capabilities in our next video.